We have a Russian aircraft in Mexico City right now. What can we do to grab it? The aircraft is supposed to leave in an hour and a half.
Oh, that's
So
fun.
we have one
We
hour
got
and a half
time.
on a Saturday to see what we can do.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavon of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who is our guest today?
We are going to have a chat with Carlos Sierra. Carlos is currently partner at Abogados Sierra. Hopefully I'm saying all those right. Prior to that, he was a partner at Alegre and Sierra, or eSierra. He was also legal counsel for Mexicana Airlines. He gets involved with a lot of different things, but he's a member of the Aviation Working Group, Aviation Law Committee of the IBA, International Registry of Advisory Board. Currently, he's the president of ADVIC. He's got a law degree from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, but then he's also done some postgraduate studies in civil and commercial and international law from the Escuela de Derecho, Duke University, Université Libre de Bruxelles, and IATA. That's a lot of different languages all at once.
No kidding, Garrick.
Yeah.
God, your accent.
I know, I have to change
I'm
them up.
almost impressed.
Yep, and he also has an LLM in air and space law from Leiden University. So we're going to talk, I think, some legal stuff today. I think he's also got a great, he's been doing this for a long time, so he's going to have some great stories for us as well. And we'll talk about, hopefully, maybe the Mexican market, see what's going on down there. So it's going to be really cool to chat with him. So, Carlos, this is your time on wing.
Just a quick intermission to pay the bills, then we'll get you back to the podcast. You've probably heard of Visual Approach Analytics. Here's what we do. Visual Approach delivers contrarian data analysis on the commercial aviation industry. Subscribers can start with our industry analysis and weekly insights, and then upgrade to access our downloadable charts and visualize market trends. You can even white label our charts in your own branding. If you need a white paper, a custom presentation with novel contrarian insights for your investors, or your board members, or your boss, yeah, we do that. Our objective is not to be the thought leaders in aviation. Our objective is to give you the tools to be one. VisualApproach.io. Check us out. Okay, back to the show.
Well, hey, Carlos, thank you again for agreeing to join us on the podcast today. And as our listeners know, what I like to ask at the beginning is figuring out how you started your career in aviation, or where the passion came from. We've heard the gamut of how people have done this, and so we'd love to hear from you in terms of where that got started and where you kind of got to where you are today. So I'll let you go.
Thank you. Well,
yeah.
Personally, thank you, Garrick, and thank you, Courtney, for inviting me. It's an awesome opportunity, and I was really looking forward to it. So thanks for having me here. How did I start it? It was accidental, as you probably heard from other people. I've loved aircraft since I was a kid, and I actually used to gather anything that people could bring me from aircraft. I don't know, napkins, flight schedules, these ticket covers that used to be around in the old days. I still have a beautiful Pan American world schedule booklet that's actually quite nice. And everything, I piled all that in a box since I was a kid. And that was a hobby. And then when I went into law school, I studied law because I actually wanted to go into politics. That was my plan. So I signed up to the National University of Mexico, which is a gigantic institution with more than 300,000 students, if you can't believe that.
Thanks.
And but very much into politics. It's like a small country in itself. So that was my plan. I started there. Then, with a lot of struggle, I finally landed a job while I was still studying at the Ministry of Budget and Planning, which is a job I absolutely hated. Because
it sounds fascinating.
But I thought that was my road into politics, which was a mess. And the only thing is that I was paid relatively well for my age, but I hated that. So once there was one time in which I was actually skipping class from the university with some friends, and we went to this cafeteria and we were in line for paying. And a friend of mine said to another friend, well, listen, that job at Mexicana that you talked to me about, I'm not going to take it. And I was in line and I said, what job are you talking about? And I said, well, there's an opportunity at the legal department at Mexicana. They want an intern and this guy doesn't want it. I said, well, I want it. So give me the phone number, right? and so I rang and I was interviewed. I was accepted in the legal department at Mexicana, but I was told that I was going to be paid a fifth of what I was being paid at the other job. But I said, well, I think I have something to learn here. And Mexicana Airlines in those days was
way. That's how
and
you know.
Totally. And Mexicana was one of these legacy airlines from the very beginning of aviation. So it was so appealing and it was so glamorous, to be honest, to work for that airline. So I said yes. And then is how I started in aviation. I loved it. I was one of the few lawyers at the legal department then that spoke a little bit of English. So I was actually thrown all of the aircraft leases on my desk. And then I started, and then there's another funny story because I started reading these leases. I had no idea what they said. I couldn't understand anything. It was totally new to me. I was 22 or 23 years old. And then all of a sudden, the Mexicana was going to receive the first batch of A320s that were purchased from Airbus. And these were very, very new A320s with V1 engines. It was. I mean, I'm talking serial numbers 234, for instance.
So
I think that was the first one.
Was that like the early 90s at that point?
It was 1991, I think, at most.
Wow.
And so I had to negotiate these leases, and I was supposed to be joined by a team from people from finance, my boss, my boss's boss, and other people, because I was very junior. And then I was thrown in this room with ILFC to negotiate these leases. And nobody was coming into the room. And honestly, I had absolutely no idea of what to say.
So wait a minute. So were you an intern at this time?
I was an intern. I was going to be in the meeting. And I was thrown into this meeting and nobody was showing up. So I was for a long while sitting down with ILFC and who was represented by John Evans, whom you've heard, that later founded Jetscape and other things, and Joseph Hermosillo, who was the general counsel at ILFC. And they saw that I had no idea, and they were actually very kind because John both of them started giving me a master class on aircraft leasing, which was totally not in respect to the lease we were going to discuss, but they just kind of, I guess they liked me, and they said, well, we're just going to teach this kid a thing or two about aircraft leasing. So we talked about maintenance reserves, overhaul of engines, return conditions, events of default, all of these niceties. And I still remember to this day how kind they were. And well, I started learning. I worked 5 years at Mexicana. Then there's another story when I was married. My wife was expecting our daughter, our first kid, and I was not making enough money. And I remember I had to, at some point, part of my job, I had to write the mortgage release of one 727 aircraft of the Mexicana fleet. So I remember I prepared that document. Everything was typewritten back then. That there were no computers, nothing. So I prepared the document and I had to go get it signed by Bank of America back then. So I went, there was nothing, no other way, no email. I went to the Bank of America office and the director of the bank was sitting there with his lawyer. And I remember it must have been a Monday because I walked into the meeting room and they were talking about golf and what they did over the weekend. So all of a sudden they said, okay, what do you want, kid? And I said, well, this is the mortgage termination for this aircraft and so on. So the guy says, okay, come here. And I showed him the document. He passed it on to his lawyer. He didn't even look at it. And the lawyer just kept talking about golf. And he wrote one comma and another comma and gave it back. I said, okay, fine. I guess it's all right. So I went back to the office. That was completed. Time passed, a couple of weeks or so. And then, as it was part of a financing arrangement, then came the legal bill for that lawyer. $5,000, I remember.
Wow, in the 90s?
And
wow,
I went for that mortgage termination.
Yeah.
So I went right into my boss's office and I said, can you believe this? I mean, this is ridiculous. I drafted the document.
Yeah.
And I told him the story. And he said, well, it's part of the finance arrangement. Those fees are payable by the borrower, which is us. And don't worry, give it to me. He signed it off, authorized it, got it paid.
Meanwhile, you're thinking $5,000.
$5,000 was what I made in about 6 months.
Yeah.
So, honestly. So I walked out of his office and I said, I'm in the wrong business here.
You're in the right business. You're on the wrong side of the table.
Wrong side
of the table. That's exactly right. Yeah. So I said, no way. So I quit it and I started my own firm.
Good for you.
When I was 28 years old in 1994. And I remember, as I said, my wife was pregnant and my dad said, that's so irresponsible. You're going to lose your job and you're going to start. That's just ridiculous. You can't do that. And I said, well, I must because I need more money. And I also felt that there was, I had noticed for some time that aircraft lessors and banks were not properly serviced in Mexico. There were firms that were doing the job. Some of them are still around, but I don't think that they really knew aviation and the jargon and everything that comes with it from within. So I noticed that every time I was across the table with another Mexican lawyer that didn't know anything about aviation, I noticed because they said, instead of saying engine, they said turbine. Instead, things of that sort. And so you could always tell. So I sensed there was some space there to work for these companies. So I quit it. We rented, I had a partner, we rented a very small cubicle in a bad area of town. And I started making phone calls. And one of the first phone calls I made, or the few phone calls I made, was to Joe Hermosillo at ILFC.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, Joe, you remember me from those years and all? I said, well, we've started this firm and I cannot even dream of, but if ILFC would ever have anything you might need in Mexico, I'm happy to help. So he said, sure, why don't you come to Los Angeles? I said, okay. So I went to Los Angeles. I met with all of the ILFC team and we were retained by ILFC.
Wow.
As local counsel.
Just like that.
Well, not just like that, but it was very, very quick. And we started working with them and doing things for them in Mexico. And then from that, came others, and then we went on. I mean, it was a difficult start, but we started calling friends and a lot of people that I had met in the leasing industry and that, and we started doing what we do now. And then I remember in 2003. I was called by Carol Chase, who has passed away. She used to be at Pegasus. She used to be general counsel of Pegasus, working for Rich Wiley. Mm-hmm. And they had this issue with a Mexican airline, and someone recommended me, and she called me, and we made a very good connection. She was a great woman and a great mentor to me, and she got me into the repossession side of the business because we started suing this airline and trying to recover all of these aircraft. And I learned so much. And from then I sort of learned to be on to take care of both aspects, the transactional work and the repo work, which is taught me a lot, so many lessons, because once you recover an aircraft in this environment, which is very hard from a legal standpoint, you learn to put a number of things in the documents that would make it easier the next time. So I started sort of selling that product, and a lot of lessors liked it. And what I noticed over the years is that the lessors had this taboo, to say it somewhat, how that there was the typical Irish lease that was floating around in those years, that was used before by GPA and the old leasing companies, that was considered to be untouchable. You couldn't change anything at all. The airlines were always pushed back in anything they wanted to change, but everything was just written and nothing could be changed. So there was no local adaptation of the remedies within the lease that could be effectively enforced in countries like Mexico, which is countries with a civil law system that is totally different from the common law system under which this type of documents are drafted, and under which this type of transactions are actually designed. So enforcing remedies in a country that with a civil law system is complex, and it's very formalistic. So the lease and the documents need to allow you to do that effectively. So I started working on that, suggesting numerous changes that were pushed back at the beginning. But when we started repossessing aircraft and doing things, lessors started realizing that local law could not be ignored, especially local procedure. And then we started suggesting a number of changes and comments and providing jurisdictional questionnaires and legal opinions that sort of resembled what you needed to do here in order to effectively enforce your rights. And that was liked. I then became involved with the aviation working group with Jeffrey Wool and people in that environment, in trying to implement in Mexico and elsewhere the Cape Town Treaty and all. And so we started more effectively enforcing rights of creditors in this environment and recovering many aircraft. We were lucky as well, because from 2000, say 1999 to 2000, starting there, all the way up to 2010, when Mexicana went out of business, we had to recover aircraft from 13 different Mexican airlines that went bust.
Sounds about right.
13?
Of all sizes.
Yeah.
13. And we just were super busy during all of that decade, and then thereafter with others. So that's essentially how our firm grew, and we do a lot of regulatory work as well. We represent international airlines, more than 30 international airlines, and we work for all of, well, I like to say all, but obviously not all, but most of the aircraft lessors that we all know, plus banks, OEMs, you name it, financiers, private equity funds, everybody that has invested in an aircraft in Mexico, we've had in one way or another something to do.
Yeah.
And
that's
are you, the law that you practice, is it exclusive to Mexico, or do you branch out to other countries with similar systems? How does that work?
Yes, we work, well, we have, as part of the sort of expansion we've experienced over the years, we've expanded to Latin America. We believe that we could, and it has worked relatively well, we could provide sort of like a one-stop solution to aircraft lessors that have aircraft in Mexico, in Argentina, in Colombia. And so we try to control the transaction, the speed, the fees, the communication with the lessor in these environments. Some of these Latin American countries we found have much less aviation than Mexico or Brazil do, for instance. So, for people to establish actually a practice of law only dedicated to aviation in a country like Bolivia or Ecuador is not possible. I mean,
Even
people
Panama.
need to do it.
Imagine,
Even Panama.
imagine
Yeah.
being the aircraft repo guy in Panama, and it's Copa. Like nobody's repossessing anything from Copa.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And maybe one firm does a lot of COPA work, but the others don't. So sometimes what lessors cannot find in Latin America, it's the knowledge of
Sure.
how to work these things out. As I said, the language for some reason is very important. I mean, and what I mean by the language, it's aviation language. I mean, what an overhaul of an engine means, what cycles and hours mean, what is an APU, what is the landing gear. I mean, these things seem obvious to you guys, but many people don't have any clue about it. I mean, we've struggled over the years to persuade judges that the aircraft is composed by a number of parts, including, for instance, the aircraft records, which they tend not to believe that the records are part of the aircraft. So explaining that, it's more complicated than you would think. So until we recover the records of, say, an aircraft or an engine, we don't have
not
the whole
complete.
aircraft.
Right.
And perhaps it's not, it loses value, etc. And the records are always in this deep, hidden warehouse, gaining, I don't know, fungus and humidity somewhere.
Right.
And gaining access to that and just inspecting them and taking them out, it's more challenging than it seems. But we need to do it in order to do the job in full.
Yeah.
And
so have you
Go ahead,
found so if you think about the last 3 decades, right, over the last 30 years or plus years, have you been able to kind of train the lessors to adapt to Mexican law, or, more so than Mexico, because of the fact that leasing has grown, globally, but also in Mexico, has Mexican law changed slightly to account for the fact that more aircraft are leased, or has it just been more lessors have adapted to be able to lease in Mexico?
I think it's the latter. I would love to say that at least they would have met in the middle, but that's not true. Mexican law has not really changed.
Okay.
I mean, Mexico, it's a signatory of the Cape Town Convention, but it didn't make the declarations. It made some of the declarations that are sort of required in order to access the discounts from Exim and the more favorable financing terms from capital markets in, say, double ETC deals or things of the sort. Mexico has stayed short of making all those declarations in full. So Cape Town is effective here, and in some way that has adapted Mexican law to the international treaty, but not to the extent it should have been or it is expected. So, that being said, there are a number of benefits that Cape Town has brought into the exercise of remedies in Mexico for a lessor, because there are a number of things that were probably less advantageous in Mexican law before that have changed. For instance, choice of law is no longer debatable. It used to be. But because of Cape Town, it is no longer questionable. So the parties can choose the law that applies to their contract without controversy. Then there's the interim relief that you can obtain from a court in order to immobilize an aircraft when you come to adduce that there is an event of default rather than proving it. So that has worked well. So in that sense, there are some benefits of Cape Town that have proven to be very helpful here, but not all of them. And the other problem is that Mexico has done a poor job at implementing legislation that underneath the international treaty would make certain things more practical in terms of the local regulation. Um, One of the things that Mexico didn't adopt, for instance, is the IDERA. We did not make the declaration that would enable the IDERA to be effective here. So deregistering an aircraft from the Mexican registry is still a complex task. It didn't used to be that complicated, but with the current government environment, it's tough. It's harder than it used to be.
Yeah.
But so I would. That's why I said I think it's the latter. Lessors have made a lot of changes in the approach they make to aircraft leases in Mexico, in the documents, in the form in which we document security interests, for instance, and the like, in order to ensure to the extent possible that these rights are more easily enforceable in this civil law environment. I'll give you an example. For instance, normally aircraft can be mortgaged, and aircraft mortgages are very common. Well, in Mexico, it's more practical to do a non-possessory pledge, which actually has the same characteristics in terms of the security that it provides. But given procedural rules of Mexican law, it's more easily enforceable. It's easier to enforce a non-possessory pledge than a mortgage. So these kind of little bits are good for lessors. It's the advice we try to give them, and it goes a long way when we try to enforce the security interest in Mexico more effectively.
Is this, you mentioned Mexican aircraft registration. Is this the reason why I think it's Volaris has quite a few N-registered airplanes? Or I don't know if those are leased or owned or what. They're just oddly N-registered.
All of the ones that are N-registered are leased. And, and the reason is that Mexican airlines generally register their own aircraft and many leased aircraft in Mexico. The problem, this dates back to the time when Aeromexico, the first Aeromexico, went bankrupt in 1988. Because normally in all countries, aircraft that are operated by the local airlines have to be registered in the country. Now, back then, when Aeromexico went bankrupt for the first time, there was a lot of pushback by lessors to lease aircraft to the new Aeromexico if they were to be registered in Mexico because of the difficulties of getting an aircraft deregistered. So, foolishly, in my opinion, the government, instead of overhauling the registration system in Mexico and make it more effective or easier to access and deregister, they started allowing aircraft to be registered outside of Mexico upon prior approval. That was sort of just an implicit right that lessors had and airlines had to request aircraft to be registered outside of Mexico for many years until the new civil aviation law was passed in 1995. When that was implemented, they wrote an article saying that you're allowed to lease aircraft operated with foreign registration as long as you get a prior approval from the Civil Aviation Authority. And so, at the request of many lessors, some airlines or most airlines have agreed to register aircraft outside of Mexico upon request. It's not that easy for them because they need to meet certain requirements from the FAA, which large airlines meet easily. Smaller operators struggle more with that, and it costs them money. So they don't love it, they don't like it, but sometimes in order to get the deal done, they have to do it. It depends a lot on the upper structure of the transaction. I mean, if there are financings in place, if there are lenders, if there are more institutional investors that are more averse to risk, this type of end registration is requested. If we're talking about a lessor that knows, I don't know, Aeromexico very well, and with which it already has, I don't know, 10, 15 aircraft, normally they're more comfortable with Mexican registration. And but in other certain deals, end registry is requested sometimes, and sometimes not only end registry. There's been aircraft with Irish registry and with French registry before, and others. Not many others, but some others, and that's how it goes.
If you were to take a kind of a step back and just look at the globe,
Mm-hmm.
from that perspective, how is Mexico most unique from the side of the business that you're on? What is it about Mexico that is just the most unique kind of from that global perspective?
Well, one thing is the size of its aviation industry and the resilience of its aviation industry, despite being in an environment in which aviation policy is lacking for many, many years. I mean, thorough aviation policy and effective laws to permit or facilitate more leasing transactions. Despite of that, airlines in Mexico, there's been many airlines in Mexico that have come in and out. And currently, aviation, the airlines that we have are very, very good credits and are very resilient. So I think that's unique about Mexico, because if it were for government policy and other things, Mexico should not have any airlines. I mean, aviation should be very complicated here. And yet it has always been. I mean, Mexico is one of the countries that started earlier in aviation. I mean, Charles Lindbergh flew here and invested in the Mexican, in the earlier version of Mexicana that was eventually also part of Pan American. So it's aviation has always been in Mexico's blood. The other thing that's unique, not to Mexico, but yes to Latin America and other countries, including Europe, it's the civil aviation system that needs to be understood more. Civil law system, pardon me, that needs to be understood more carefully in order to enforce rights, as I was mentioning before. And another thing that I find unique is how many airlines have failed, and how active and contentious aviation is in Mexico. I mean, if you go to Colombia being Colombia, which is a large country with a lot of aviation, there's never been a repossession, a hostile repossession there. I mean, there's some aircraft that have gone back to lessors more in amicable terms, but there's never been proceedings to recover an aircraft. It's interesting. We've recovered nearly 350 more than nearly 400 aircraft over so many years, and in all sorts of ways. I mean, consensual, friendly, unfriendly, enforcing court orders in the middle of the night, you name it. I mean, we've covered the whole spectrum. and that makes Mexico unique, I think. Interestingly, because also Mexico shares probably the largest aviation border crossing, which is with the United States in the world, and so the geographical situation of the country makes it unavoidable to have a robust aviation industry, in spite of anything against. So I would say that's what it is.
That's very unique. I mean, Mexico's very unique in its geography too, right? And just in terms of the airlines. I mean, yes, you have the very, very large capital city right in the middle, but it's up at what, 8,500 feet, 8,000 feet?
Yeah.
7,000. High enough that it's hard to breathe for me anyway. But then you have you have a very large and spread out country, right? To go from Cancun to Tijuana is what, 6 hours, 5 hours? I mean,
it's a 4.5 hour flight from Cancun to Tijuana, and Mexico has, I think, more than 52 airports, and the orography, the mountains. We don't have any trains, any passenger trains, and I mean we have a few, but not that many. And going by road is very painful because the mountains are very difficult to cross. So flying is unavoidable. It's the only way to service some cities, and there's a need for aviation, and there's a market for aviation that is also enormous. Because, for instance, in Mexico, probably because of the income of the people, or how much people make, or how young the population is, low cost airlines, or the Mexican version of low cost airlines has thrived enormously. Like Viva and Volaris really have a greenfield of potential customers, and you see it if you fly. Like I fly to Mexico City on Volaris or Viva Aerobus, which is obviously cheaper and very convenient. They have lots of flights, but you see it in the people on board the plane. I mean, you can see that there are always many people that have never been on an aircraft. They clap on landing, and they're scared when the
wait. You're not supposed to do that. I thought, isn't that what you do every time?
Well, I guess, but so you can see it. You can see it. Well, if you get on an Aeromexico airplane, you see a different demography, because it's a sky team, and you have people from Europe and people from the US and people from Mexico that pay a bit more, and you have business class and the legacy model, and there's a market for that too. Aeromexico is doing well, actually, but the potential of the low cost service here. It's like Viva Aerobus. Viva Aerobus is owned now by Mr. Alcantara, who used to be a partner of the Ryan family when it was formed, and he owns an enormous bus company for ground transportation. And in their business model, you can buy an airplane ticket on board one of these buses. They sell you the plane on Viva Aerobus when you're going on the bus, and vice versa.
So how do they do that? They just, when you're stuck in traffic, they turn the air conditioning off, and then they come through and sell you airplane tickets?
I guess that's how they do it. But it is an amazing connection of getting people from the bus onto the aircraft, and it has worked well for the Mexican market. So I think that those airlines have a large room to expand.
The country that always looked most similar to Mexico for me, and I guess Mexico is a little bit more advanced in aviation, but it's India, because you have a India is obviously significantly larger by population, but you have these domestic connections. And in India, you have the rail system, but you also have the bus system. And what I think people miss about Mexico, first of all, there's over 100 million people. So it's three times as many people as Canada.
130 million people.
100. There you go. I must have counted yesterday. But right. So there you go. 130 million people.
Let's leave it at last week.
But four times Canada, right? And growing. But what very few people outside Mexico really appreciate about Mexico is just how developed the bus market is.
Oh, yeah.
And the number of people who ride on buses long haul, right? In inner city buses. And some of these are like, they're overnight buses. So they're like lie flat and beautiful. Like some of the best buses in the world, but just the quantity of people who travel on buses is very similar to India, where you have so many people traveling, just not necessarily by airplane.
Right. No, that's true. That is true. And yes, I've been told by people from the US and from other countries about the quality of these buses sometimes, because they have these lay flat, almost first class seats that people, I mean, if you think about it, I'm in Cancun going to Mexico City from Cancun, as you have to go around the Gulf. We won't name the Gulf, but the Gulf. You have to,
no. It's you're good. We call it the Gulf of Mexico still.
Right, yeah. But you have to travel for 24 hours, maybe more.
Wow. Yeah.
Maybe 30 hours on a bus, and however comfortable, that's a lot of hours.
Yeah, that's a
30
long,
hours.
yeah, that's a long trip.
What, a 2-hour flight? I mean,
it's an hour and 50 minutes to 2 hours.
Wow,
Yes.
that's a huge difference. Yeah, that's crazy.
It's a huge difference.
But then you got the traffic from the airport to where you're going in Mexico City. So that's another 20 hours.
Well, I fly because of where I live in Mexico City. I fly to Toluca Airport.
Oh, yes.
These days. And that it's not a very pretty airport, but it's empty. So it's absolutely wonderful.
So you're like on the Santa Fe side. You drive up the...
Yeah, exactly.
Drive up the mountain. Yeah. Very nice.
Right. I live kind of halfway between Toluca Airport and Santa Fe. And our office is in Santa Fe, so it's actually quite convenient. There are not that many flights, but I have the ones I like already cherry picked, and I much prefer to do that than flying to Mexico City. I mean, Aeromexico has lost me as a frequent flyer on account of that, but because I don't fly to Toluca. But
to get from the airport to Santa Fe, and it's been a while since I've been to Mexico City, but I mean, it could take over an hour, right? It may
3 hours easily at certain times of the day. They can take up to 3 hours.
Yeah.
Oh, easily. Mexico City, it's a very complicated city for driving, and you really need to fly from point A to point B. I remember we used to, when we were repossessing from Mexicana in 2010. GCAS had 36 aircraft at Mexicana. So they sent a whole bunch of people to camp down in Mexico City, and we were working with the government and the airline and everyone else trying to recover this aircraft. And our office is in Santa Fe, and they always stayed at the JW Marriott in Polanco.
Oh, that's right. I used to stay. Yeah, I know it well.
Right. And they always said, okay, we'll have a team back every day of everything everybody did at the bar at the JW Marriott at 7 p.m. Well, to be there at 7 p.m., I had to leave my office at 5 p.m. in order to make it to the daily meeting. So just as an example.
And it's not far, right? From Polanco to Santa Fe, it's not far, but there's no...
It must be 8 miles away or something.
Oh, wow.
It's just the traffic. It's horrible.
Wow.
Right.
So I'd love to touch more on, you've obviously mentioned how you've repossessed quite a few aircraft or helped, to be able to get that. I mean, so, I think you said something around close to 400.
Yeah.
Can you share any of the stories that, the ones that stand out in terms of the most interesting, whether it's been because they were challenging or whether it's because you have to have some good stories. 400.
Oh, definitely.
There's definitely some.
We could be here all day. Honestly, and some of these stories are so funny now because they weren't funny then, but so interesting that have been. Our clients have displayed them in conferences, like there's this. The recovery of these aircraft for GCAS from Mexicana. There was a bit of everything. We recovered the A318s first. First, we recovered ILFC's aircraft, then others. But at some point, the union, and that's another thing that makes Mexico unique, I've found. The labor unions started blocking the recovery, and the new owners of the leftovers of Mexicana were favoring them in that sense. So at some point, we had our court orders in order to repossess the aircraft. We were going to pick up a lot of these were CRJs and 717s that were at Mexicana, owned by GCAS, and we were ready to pull those out. And we tried, but the union wouldn't let us. So at some point, we managed to obtain the necessary permits and all, and the court order in order for the police to assist us. And we came with police in riot gear over the airside of the airport.
Mm.
And
So when you say
and
police assistance, you mean like literally walking you to the airplane and making
yes,
Wow.
it was funny because I mean, these
I'm sure
orders
you were
were hard
laughing.
to get. We went to the airport with the GCAS team, and we talked to the, I don't know, the commander of the police there, who was a very severe guy, and we said, okay, how are we going to do this? And he said, okay, we're going to go airside with 80 police officers. We're going to go airside and we're going to get to the maintenance base through the runways. And I said, okay, fine. So where do we go with you? And he said, no, wait a minute. You guys are not coming in our vehicles. You find your way. I said, okay, that's easy. So we started calling people. We found this maintenance company that had a van, like a technician's van with no windows. So we jumped on board that van. There's pictures of it. And it was, the lawyers, the notary, the court officer. And we showed up in this van. We're sitting on the floor of the van. We showed up in this van, and we looked like clowns coming out of this van. All of these lawyers. But these police officers lined up, and workers and people from the company started coming out in numbers, blocking the aircraft with pushback trucks and other baggage carts and everything, and not letting us in. And the situation became at some point very, very tense because one of these people apparently hurt one of the police officers, and the commander of the police force was furious, and he was looking at us, like people from GCAS and myself, saying, are we going to do this or not? And the court officer, are we going to do this or not? And it was super tense. And at some point, GCAS rightly said, no, we're not doing it. People are going to be hurt here, and we can't.
Yeah.
So we went out. People were cheering and clapping from the Mexicana side, and we left. And we eventually were able to enforce that court order by agreeing with the company and other people at the behest of the court, and everything worked out fine. But there are pictures of that day of all these police officers, and GCAS, John Luden and Ed Shirt presented these pictures at conferences. That's why I'm comfortable talking about it, because everybody was fascinating to see these police officers recovering aircraft. So that's one. The other one is another interesting one is with Brian Reynolds, who was at AWAS back then. We were trying to recover this aircraft from a company called Avolar, which went out of business. So he came to Mexico City with one of the lawyers from AWAS. I forgot her name, but she was very kind. And we went to see the CEO of the company of Avolar in Mexico City. And the guy said, well, fine. We said, we want to recover this aircraft. This was one aircraft. And he said, well, fine. I can't say anything about it. You need to go talk to these guys, which were some Armenian guys that had been selling him fuel. And that on account of how much fuel he owed, they took control of the airline. Did you see The Sopranos ever?
Well, yeah, it sounds...
it sounds very much,
Same thing. So he says, okay, you have to talk to this guy. It's off my hands. So Brian and us, we said, okay, well, let's go. And we jumped on a plane and we flew to Tijuana to cross to Los Angeles. We went eventually in Los Angeles. This guy was in Los Angeles. So we went to see him. And I don't know, for anyone that knows how around LAX airport everything is, and you have all of these airline offices at Airport Boulevard that are not especially very fancy. These are old offices full of operational teams and all. So we went to one of these offices at Airport Boulevard, and we walked into the building. We go to the floor, and the whole office was like the Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. I mean, it had drapes, it had all of this marble, it had bodyguards at the door.
Yeah.
And so he said, "Oh, well, we're here to see this guy. Okay, yeah, come in." They sit us at this long meeting room table, and all of a sudden comes this guy with his hair down to here, with an open silk Versace shirt and gold chains. And he sits like this, and he says, "What can I do for you?" We said, "Well, okay, we're here to try to recover this aircraft. Yeah, sure. If I'm paid what I'm owed, you can take the aircraft." And then we left. And we were like super shocked about the whole thing because it was so intimidating. And we called our lawyer, John Torriello, who was the litigator that was handling the case in New York. And he was a tremendous lawyer. I think he's the best litigator in New York I've ever known. And he told me over the phone, we were on the sidewalk, and he said, "Well, if you can get anything in your hands that shows that this guy is taking management decisions in the company, as he's a US resident, I can have him deported. We can threaten him with that and close his companies, etc." And I said, "Well, that doesn't seem too easy, but let's see what we can do." And then, out of getting nothing out of our trip, we went back to Tijuana, and the AWAS guys, Brian, wanted to see the facilities of the company that were at Tijuana Airport, at the maintenance hangar, and I don't know, talk to someone there. So we went really for nothing. And as we were coming down the stairs, I saw this bulletin board, and I saw this paper signed by this Armenian guy telling the workers that they shouldn't worry, that the company was being restructured and that everything would be okay. Obviously, the company was out of business by then. So I saw that, and I ripped it off the wall. And I took it with me. I folded it, and I put it in my pocket. And it ripped, so it wasn't even complete. And when I got back, I said, "John, this is all I could find." And he said, "That's enough. Just send it to me, ripped as it is. That's what I needed." Well, the guys returned the aircraft, and I think they paid the debt. I'm not sure about that, but everything was resolved magically. So that was another funny story.
Wow. Yeah. That's a little, I'm convinced. Be careful with that, right? I mean, you don't want to get the knock on the door to be like, "Hey, remember me?"
No, I don't.
Right?
This was ages ago, so I'm happy.
But, wow.
The last one
needs to be... go ahead. I want to hear this.
I was just going to mention one more recent in which we recovered one of the Russian operated aircraft for Air Castle.
That's funny. So we go from the Armenian mobster. Where can you go from there? With the Russian
aircraft.
With the Russians. Well, that is funny. And I can mention names and all because actually Steve Quinn from Air Castle and Chris Beers presented that at ISTAT a couple of years ago. Well, when it happened. Mm-hmm. And this was so funny because I was just enjoying my Saturday one day at 11 in the morning, and I get this call from Steve Quinn saying, "Hey, Carlos, how are you doing? Listen, we have a Russian aircraft operated by one of the Russian airlines in Mexico City right now, a 777, no less. And what can we do to grab it?" And said, "Steve, I don't know." I mean, he said, "Okay, let me complicate things for you a little bit more. The aircraft is supposed to leave in an hour and a half. So we have 1 hour and a half on a Saturday to see what we can do."
So wait a minute. No, listen. So here's what you said. I'll end the story. You got all those Mexicana former employees to park baggage carts behind the airplane, right? And they all stood out and faced down the cops.
That would have been that was option one. That was option one. No, but he said, "Listen, what can we do about this?" And then we started brainstorming, and he said, "Well, you need to go to the airport authorities and tell them that the lease is in default." And I said, "Steve, that's not going to fly. I mean, they don't care about the lease, much less of a Russian aircraft. They don't care about the lease of a Mexican airline, much less about a Russian aircraft that's fully authorized to operate." So we started going in circles. And at some point, I said, well, we need to give the authorities a story that makes the aircraft not airworthy, that tells them that they shouldn't approve the flight. So we started going around and said, okay, what about insurance?
Mm-hmm.
So Steve said, well, that sounds good. Maybe because the sanctions from the European Union had just been enacted. So we started saying, well, maybe this invalidates the insurance. Well, then we found that the insurance was Russian, but then we said, well, okay, the reinsurance. And we started gathering information. There was not much. There was some newsflash or bulletin issued by Clifford Chance by then, mentioning that possibly because of the sanctions, and we started getting everything we could. I got some people from our team at the office to make a big binder on a filing. So we wrote a letter to the director of aviation at the AFAC, and we filed it at the airport, and we got a stamp saying we filed this on time. So we started calling the director of aviation from AFAC. We got him out of a party. By this time, it was a bit later in the day. And we said, you can't let this aircraft go because there's no insurance. And he said, oh, you got to be kidding. There is insurance. And I mean, the plane is fully authorized. I can't stop it. And we said, well, we've already made this filing and we've provided evidence that there is no insurance coverage, and it's a safety item. It's an airworthy item, so you can't let it go. But if you let it go, it's fine. If it falls in the middle of the ocean, it's really on you because we told you already.
Oh, wow.
And the guy said, okay, it won't go. So
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so this whole story took place in an hour and a half?
Yeah, a bit more because there was a delay in the departure, fortunately. I don't know on account of what, but the plane took a bit longer to depart.
Yeah.
So maybe 3 hours. And
that's insane.
Wow. So you are putting together binders and getting documents signed, and they're boarding the flight.
It was not a passenger flight because it was one of these aircraft that flew. It was a passenger airliner, but it wasn't flying passengers because it was one of these flights that operated during COVID with only medical equipment and masks and things. So it had cargo, and it was parked at the cargo apron at Mexico City. So
wow.
So that was funny. We managed to recover, and then we took it. They took it to the Mexicana MRO, and then the aircraft was repossessed. And then we with a similar argument, we snatched two others from other lessors. So two other 777s operated by a Russian airline.
Yeah. Wow.
So
that's a great.
This was one of the few jurisdictions in which that was able to happen.
Okay, maybe that answers my question. I was just curious if this type of situation played out anywhere else other than Mexico, because the problem here wasn't Mexico, it was Russia, right? It was the Russian sanctions, and since were they in default? Were they not paying the lease, or how?
Well, they
couldn't pay the lease, right?
I think they were in default under the lease for some reason. Yes, and also, well, there had to be some justification because these aircraft were going back to Russia to never go out again. And remember what Russia did at that moment is it without deregistering the aircraft, which most of the Russian operated aircraft were registered in Bermuda. For some reason, the Russian registry was not widely used. But at the time this happened, the Russian authorities instructed the registration of all these aircraft in Russia without canceling the Bermudan registration. But in order for the Russian airlines to continue operating them wherever they could without being sanctioned. And that's what happened. So many aircraft, this resulted eventually on aircraft that were that stayed in Russia forcefully. This resulted in a very large insurance case brought up by many lessors that has just been resolved recently. And yeah, so that was a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, it's fascinating to me because that could have only happened with, I think, today's technology of being able to track your airplanes.
Yeah,
because I'm sure,
Yeah.
right? They were just tracking all the aircraft that they were just, and it's like it just happens to be, this isn't a jurisdiction where we feel we could have a chance to take it. But think 20 years back, right? You wouldn't have.
Well,
right, unless you had somebody at the airport that'd be like, "Hey, by the way, I think this is your airplane." Like you wouldn't have known.
Back to the Mexicana days, 2010. There was this big lessor, wanting to repossess a number of aircraft, and he wanted to know where these aircraft were flying to, because the airline was still flying them in the very last few days, and many of them were flying to the United States, so they wanted to know where they could snatch them. So he calls me and says, I need to find out where all of our aircraft are flying to. And I said, well, yeah, but how do we do that? And I said, well, buy tickets, get boarding passes, and get people to the gates. And we did.
See where they go.
and okay, so you had people at the gates looking at tail numbers and where they're going.
At the window.
Oh, genius.
I'm saying, okay, aircraft registration so-and-so is flying to Chicago, and aircraft registration so-and-so is flying to Miami.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And literally, the way to know, I mean, absent this technology that Gary was mentioning, was to buy tickets, get boarding passes, go to the gates,
that's genius.
Look out the window.
Wow.
And then and not get on the airplane. They probably just called and said, okay, this airplane's going here, this is going there. And
our team, with the people we sent to the airport to do this, did not fly. They just
walked around. Yeah. Yeah. That's hilarious.
Just went back home.
Wow. Yeah.
This is the next generation of the TV show Suits, if you're familiar. Like Suits Mexico.
Yes,
I'm telling you.
Suits Mexico.
This is that level of, I mean, when you think about, the term we use is like thinking outside the box type of thing. Like, that's it. Buy a ticket, look out the window, see what it says.
Absolutely. Yep. And we did that. And plus many other things. I mean, we've had to carry boxes out. I mean, I've had lawyers that worked for us saying at some point, okay, I wasn't hired to carry boxes, and said, shut up, you carry the box.
Just keep walking and don't look back.
At $400 an hour, I don't care. Yeah. To carry these boxes out of here. And we literally did that. I mean, it's, repossession it's an adventure. And this is where really it gets real. I mean, you can have your leases, you can have everything written down, but, and I get asked the question over and over again, how long will it take me to recover my aircraft? How long will it take me to win in court? How many months? How many hours? It's very difficult to say. It's always very circumstantial. You can walk in and find the aircraft in pieces with the engines in shops, on other aircraft, parts just thrown around there, the record somewhere. From Interjet, we recovered an aircraft. The last A320 we recovered 65 aircraft from there. The last A320 we recovered was in the middle of a major maintenance service. Yeah. So it was totally disassembled. And then we had the union impeding the repair. So it was complicated to finally get the court order and all to be able to assemble the aircraft, find the parts. The lessor had to send engines down, because I think their other engine was around. It was very complicated in that environment to just pull an aircraft back together.
Yeah.
And but we were able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Speaking of Interjet and Russian airplanes, whatever happened to the superjets?
Well, they're sitting there.
They're still in Mexico.
Yeah, I'm not at liberty to talk much about that one
Fair
because
enough.
that's a live case.
But the airplanes are still there.
The planes are still there.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing because those aircraft are a disaster. I mean, since the company acquired them, they were not fully certified to fly. The problem, I was told, was that the aircraft as a whole was certified by EASA because these aircraft had European engines and it was a consortium. And what apparently happened is that as they took them early and they were not fully certified, what was not certified individually were the parts. So, for instance, the plane was operating, and if I don't know, a latch or a door or something became had to be replaced, that door was available but was not certified by EASA yet. So they couldn't install it, they couldn't fly it. So they had to park these aircraft pretty much new because of all the lack of a tiny part that was not properly certified yet. That's what I was told by Interjet. I don't want to say that's absolutely right, but that's what I was told at some point.
I mean, I remember
technicians.
when those aircraft were flying. So I'm in the Dallas area. I remember seeing a Superjet in Dallas, and I thought they were not certified in the U.S., but I guess that didn't matter because they were flying from another country, so it wasn't a domestic flight.
Yes.
So who knows with the parts? But that's fascinating. So, and I'm sure
that was a strange aircraft to get on to fly on. I tried to not fly on those planes, but for some time. But then I was taking an Interjet flight, and the aircraft was replaced by one of these, and I flew on it. It was a very funny feeling. It was like flying on a Volkswagen. It was like a small, very noisy aircraft. It was like very, very weird.
Yeah. Wow.
But well,
I mean, it's also so distinctly Mexico, right? There are all of these stories everywhere, still, like you said, airplanes still kind of parked, off to the side somewhere. You still find old 727s parked here and there. Yes. We were talking about that before we started. And I know so there was Interjet, but then after Interjet, really nothing until most recently Magna Charters, or was there one in between?
No, we had Aeromar.
Yeah,
in the middle,
right.
Which were aircraft that we recovered.
Oh wow!
For export credit agencies that ended up owning them, and we went through the full process, and we were able to recover possession. And we've had some issues with the union. The unions placed an attachment on those aircraft that we had to get rid of. We managed to get rid of that. And I mentioned these unions because that is another thing that's unique here. The rights of workers always alleging things that obviously are not valid, but that in this current environment are entertained by the government authorities. So we were able to dismiss those attachments because they were illegal, but it took us some time, which is bad for the industry here because the time frame that it takes to accomplish a repossession has increased. When we recovered from Mexicana, we recovered 77 aircraft from Mexicana in 2010, in total, out of a fleet of 104. Mm-hmm. We were able to recover 9 of which were owned by the company, and the rest were owned by people we didn't represent. But we recovered 77 in a time frame of 4 months. All of them.
Wow. That's impressive.
While now, I mean, that was a record I wanted to keep. And in this environment, with Interjet and Aeromar, we have not been able to really meet that mark anymore. The situation legally has deteriorated.
Do the labor unions, the represented employees, do they have some sort of claim to credits in Mexico that you don't see in other bankruptcy courts, or how does
They
that
are a
work?
preferential creditor, the workers,
Oh,
and
okay.
they have. I mean, if, in insolvency proceedings, firstly go anyone holding a security interest, then the workers, then the tax authorities, then everyone else. And the workers have a claim against assets of the company,
Sure.
but not against assets that are not owned by the company. And the type of attachments that they placed in this case were illegal because they were placed by labor authorities that are ignorant, I have to say, of the circumstances of
Right.
the ownership of the aircraft and how they're operated by the airline. So some officer from the labor tribunal comes along and says Aeromar and slaps an attachment on it, and then you have to go to court to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous. And honestly, the only thing you have to prove, which is not that complicated, is that the aircraft is not owned by Aeromar, and that's it. But it takes a long time. The problem with the Mexican legal system, as with all civil law systems, also in Latin America, is that the civil law system is very formalistic. So everything you do has to be filed in court, has to be reviewed by the judge. Everything has to be translated into Spanish, attached with an apostille, with ink signatures. There is no fast track to those type of formalities and issues. You have to have a valid power of attorney. Every time you file a power of attorney, the counterpart will always challenge it just for the fun of it. That wastes time.
Yeah.
It's very slow because all of the paperwork and the whole proceeding is very, very, very complicated. And in Mexico, you cannot exercise self-help remedies as you can in common law countries. I mean, all of these programs you see about people repossessing cars in the US and things like that, that they just come with a crane and take the car away. You can't do that here. I mean, and neither cars nor aircraft nor anything. It's a crime. You can go to jail if you don't have a court order to repossess. And getting the court order takes a while. So it's not as easy as it seems.
See, you keep saying it takes a while, but what I hear is billable hours.
Oh, well, I wish, but no, the lessors know better. They don't let you
of course.
spin out of control. But yeah, it requires a lot of work. It does require a lot of work and a lot of effort to circumvent all of these difficulties. And that is what at the beginning of our conversation I was saying, that it's important for lessors and financiers to take into account so as to ensure that the document is the proper tool to enforce these rights. For instance, if you say, okay, this contract is governed by New York law, and you can only resolve controversies under the courts of New York, then you go to a court in Mexico and the judge declares that it is incompetent and that he or she has no jurisdiction to hear the case because the contract says New York courts. If you go to New York and get a judgment, which could be quick and easy, and you bring it down to Mexico, to validate that court judgment could take a process that would last, 6 years, because it has to be made compatible with Mexican law, which is very difficult because judges in New York don't issue their judgments in the way in which Mexican judges issue their judgments. So to enforce a foreign court judgment in Mexico, it's a nightmare. So what I tell all my clients is what you need to do is to have the contractual provisions that make it easy for you to stand before a Mexican judge and enforce your remedies here. Because that's the quickest way. And it's unavoidable. If the aircraft is sitting in Mexico and nobody wants to give it back to you, before or after, you're going to have to stand before a Mexican judge. So the easier that is made by the transaction documents, or allowed by the transaction documents, the faster you will get your aircraft out. That is absolutely certain.
Wow. So,
And those are the kind of things that we advise our clients to take into account,
Yeah.
and they do.
Yeah.
And in many, many cases, because of having sound documents, we've succeeded in repossessing very effectively in many cases.
So I'd like to touch briefly on, there's a lot of talk today about the advancement of technology, right? The use of AI and that kind of stuff. And to me, the air castle scenario, right, where you've got a limited amount of time trying to figure out all the different things that you could do.
Right.
Do you today utilize, the advance in technology, things like that, to be able to figure out what are all the different things that we can do in a more efficient manner, right? Is that something that, or is it just more like, hey, let's just get, guys that have had the experience and let's just see who comes up with what? I'd love to, I don't know, how do you kind of take advantage of technology today to try to kind of make those kinds of speedy decisions like faster?
Well, to try to find out where the aircraft is going or where it is now with technology,
Right.
It's very easy. And we've also used databases to try to find the ownership record of the aircraft or some information about prior operators and other things. Really, what has no technological substitute yet, it's having to sit before the judge or the aviation authority people and just beg them to do their job. That there's AI hasn't figured out a way around that one.
Yeah.
But to the extent we can, in terms of research of arguments and things, we try to use technology. AI technology and law are a difficult mix because AI is substituting the work that lawyers do very rapidly. So we need to see how that evolves eventually.
Yeah.
But at least when the part of the lawyer's work that you do, it's going and roll up your sleeves and get your shoes dirty, getting the aircraft out. I think that has to be done live at the airport. That there's yet no other way.
Yeah. Well, and look, I think there's still no substitution for experience, right? I mean, it's one thing to be able to just have, a tool that looks at, all right, what has been said, or look at the language or things like that. But for somebody to be like, well, I remember when we did this, and this is what got us to resolve this issue. Or, I mean, you still can't find that. And, right?
The Aircastle example, it's a good one because we were able to find the information to make a reasonable case that insurance was lacking. And for that, we had to procure information that we found over websites and over the internet. It would have been very difficult in the old days to get that information so quickly and so accurately, because all the information about the EU sanctions on Russia and arguments related to the effectiveness of insurance and precedents and everything we could find and gather within an hour or two was available in databases that were not existent 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But that's not that wasn't the impressive part of that story for me. What was impressive for me was you knew who to call and you got him on the phone and he came out of the party.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And
we knew that guy.
You got him to pick up the phone and make a decision, and then you knew exactly what to do once that verbal decision was made. I find there's no substitute for that.
No.
I think so. And that I'll say specifically about that guy, that's someone I personally had been dealing with for the past, 15 years since he has been at AFAC and before DGAC and he had several jobs. And at some point I remember that I was in the negotiations of the bilateral agreement between Luxembourg and Mexico with him across the table. So we know each other. I mean, aviation, it's a lot about relationships.
It is, yeah.
I mean, I don't want to flatter myself, but I don't know if he could have come out of the party for anyone else. I mean,
right. Yeah.
That's what relationship does.
It was a party, and he didn't have to get out of it.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but knowing that
I
you
also
called
had
us for a
his cell
specific
phone,
reason.
which was helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, it's great.
So but that is a lot of what aviation is. I mean, aviation, it's a close knit of professionals in every area: technical, scheduling, legal, finance, you name it. That work together and know each other. I mean, aviation, it's a huge worldwide network. Not so huge, but it's a very close knit worldwide network of people that always share the same problems and the same pains and resolve things together. So even here, that plays a role.
Yeah. Now, so when you look at your career being in Mexico, what would you say are the positives of the industry in the Mexican market over those last 30 years, right? We talked about law and how hasn't changed too much, but that's one thing about it. I love about aviation is that it does evolve over time based on the consumer, based on technology, based on the regions, right? So what, from where you stand, what have you seen over the last 30 plus years?
Well, I have seen an industry that has evolved for the better. After all of these airline failures between 2000 and 2010, and after the previous era where airlines, Mexicana and Aeromexico, were owned by the government, I have seen an aviation industry that has become more sophisticated, better financed, more professional, more responsible, providing better service, more reliable with better aircraft. And I guess I'm a little bit proud to have facilitated that to the extent I can in what I do, to be a reliable source of service that facilitates these transactions. It's good, and I think I have seen that change over the years. I was saying at the beginning that when I started doing this, I saw there was a need for lessors and airlines to communicate better, to understand each other better, and to be able to work out better deals, and that was needed. That has changed. I think also the authorities have, well, I have to say, in recent years have gone backwards, but up to a certain point, they had become more knowledgeable of what an aircraft lessor is. I mean, back when I worked at Mexicana in the early 90s, you went to see the head of the DGAC back then, the general director of the DGAC, and he didn't know that aircraft were leased. And they didn't know that not all aircraft were owned by the airlines. I mean, we're talking a little bit after the days when aircraft were purchased in cash by airlines. I mean, I remember when I worked in Mexicana, there was a story about the CEO, the Manuel Sosa, who lasted for many, many decades as CEO of the company, had this little wooden box in his office. And every time he went to Boeing to pick up an aircraft, he would take the check in this little box and pay for it right there.
Yeah, wow.
In Seattle. And he would pull out the check. Somebody would run to the bank immediately, I guess. Yeah. But he would. He handed a check for the full value of the aircraft back in the 80s. So if you compare that with, I don't know, PDP financing and double ETCs and ABSs and all of the structures we see and live through today, that has changed. And Mexico has not been absent from it.
Yeah.
And I like to see that. I mean, these Avolars, like the one the plane we recovered for AWAS, plus many others, Aladia, Azteca, Aviaxa, Nova Air, all of these airlines from the past that were so unprofessional and so unreliable, owned by all these shady
Yeah.
individuals that ran away with whatever they could and left everybody stranded. That has changed. You would never see Volaris or Aeromexico or Viva ever attempt that at all. I mean, these airlines are run by professionals that have been around for years that are equivalent to anyone around the world.
Yeah.
Well,
So
the teams are professional, but the owners are like they are very well known. They tend to be very well known people with other businesses. So the idea of just kind of disappearing or just allowing things to fail, it would affect other businesses. You mentioned, what was it, Alcantara at
right at Viva, yes.
at Viva? I mean, you had who was the Interjet?
Well, you have the Aleman family.
Oh, Miguel Alemán, that's right.
Very respectable, but at some point they
Well, at some
failed
point,
to
run out, right?
Yeah, right. They ran out. Yeah, but I mean, Aeromexico is a public company. Volaris is a public company. Mr. Alcantara, as you well said, has many business endeavors that he would not risk for anything. Viva is now merging. Well, not yet, but they've announced that they will be merging eventually with Volaris, and that will create a very large airline in this environment. And I would assume they will go public as well, and that means many people own these businesses. Plus, they operate aircraft that are owned by institutional investors from around the world that trust them, trust the airlines' credit. I've seen, for example, Mexico, as I was saying, came short to make all of the ratifying declarations of Cape Town, which would enable the capital markets to do WTC deals. And yet the airlines' credits are so strong that I've been called by people in capital markets before trying to say, okay, is there a way in which we could circumvent these Cape Town requirements so we could do a deal of this nature in Mexico? Because we like the airlines' credit. We want to do this type of business with them. So I think that would solve the issue, because once you have a strong credit and good financiers on the other side, you find a way, and a lot of that passes through give them certainty that however difficult this environment might be, everything is solvable if you take the right steps, and you can have a reliable lease in a reliable environment, and that is what has come a long way, I think, over the past 30 years.
Yeah, that's great.
So one quick question for you. As a Mexican citizen who flies often, now that we have, let's assume the Viva Volaris merger goes through, is Mexico too large of an aviation market for a duopoly? Or do you think it can, those Aeromexico and I don't even know what they're going to call it going forward, those two large airlines will be enough for Mexico, or do you think you'll see more startups?
I think those two large airlines will be hard to challenge if unless someone comes up with a lot of money and with a very sound business plan. It's not like in the old days in which, I don't know, a guy that owned hotels would think, oh, I want to have an airline, would buy a couple of old 727s, fly them until they would bust and disrupt a market with very low fares and then go out of business. That I don't think will happen again. That being said, there are some areas of air transportation in Mexico that will or might need to be serviced better. Like there were models before of charter airlines that serve the US or Canada, Mexico market that could still surface. I think that is underserved. And I mean, the legacy carriers took that space after 2008 or 9 or so, because there used to be all of these other airlines like Ryanair, not Ryanair from Ireland, Ryan International from Wichita.
Oh, that's
And,
right. Yeah.
Yes, and Transmeridian and Champion Air and USA 3000 and you named it. All of these airlines used to fly all of this leisure market to Mexican beaches and Caribbean destinations. And then they were taken over by the legacy carriers and then the US LLCs. But now maybe there's a niche for this type of market again. That's one thing. The other is the regional market in the west part of the country, northwest part of the country, that used to be served ages ago by another defunct airline called Aero California, that had at some point about 20 aircraft or so. And I think there might be space for someone to start servicing there. Although Aeromexico and Volaris and Viva perhaps would disagree with me, because I think they do a good job in every market. There's also a well-balanced mix, because Aeromexico, it's a legacy carrier with that type of service, and it's a hub and spoke system in which they fly primarily out of Mexico City. From around the world. They service Asia and Europe, and they fly people in the US, of course, South America. They fly people through Mexico City everywhere else. And Volaris and Viva are point to point. They have smaller hubs, but they do a lot of the direct flying, for instance, to Toluca, as I was saying, out of Cancun. Aeromexico cannot service Toluca efficiently because they have to go through Mexico City. Yeah. But it's a mix of both types of service, and I think it works for both. And so I don't know. I mean, there's always someone willing to open an airline. Well, the government just did, opening
Mexicana,
this
of course.
new version of Mexicana.
New
which
Mexicana.
is a disaster. It's a disaster. I mean, it's run by the military. Mm-hmm. They will have 20 brand new Embraer aircraft. They right now, I think, have around 7 or 8 that they've taken delivery of, and they can't manage to get a share of the market that makes that business meaningful. It's just a waste of government money and a waste of time and effort. And I don't think it's going to go anywhere until, I don't know, a future administration maybe sells it off or closes it down. I don't know, but that they're not causing any damage to the current market distribution. They have less than 1%. It's incredible. And that's because of this obnoxious decision of flying out of the new Mexico City airport that's super far away and nobody flies from. So it's just, I mean, that's why I was saying that I'm always surprised about how resilient the Mexican aviation industry is. Because, I mean, we were on the verge of having a world-class mega hub airport being built, on which, for instance, I know Aeromexico was betting its future to become, I don't know, the next Turkish Airlines, because of how well they could connect as a hub of so many people that may not be able to go through the United States or not want to, from Asia, South America, and Europe, etc. It would have been a fantastic airport. In the master plan of that airport, it would eventually have had 6 runways.
Wow!
So it was an enormous project.
And it started, right? I mean, you can still see where they were moving dirt, and I think they even laid like foundations and stuff.
30% built.
Wow!
When they shut
built.
it down, 30% built. It was probably the worst error I've ever seen anybody, a president from anywhere in the world, make. It was a disaster, because besides it was funded through bonds issued in the United States and elsewhere by a lot of investors. It was privately funded, and to shut that project down, the government had to indemnify all of these bondholders, and it's still doing so today. So it was in the same. So how can you conceive that if an airline is betting its future on this type of infrastructure, then this is cancelled, and then it has to change gears and do something else and still be doing well today, as they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, how many times in aviation you have to just change mode because of enough it is with COVID, wars, fuel prices, you name it. And then to have all of these unpredictable situations in Mexico makes it very hard.
Yeah.
I mean, Garrick, if you ever have time with nothing to do and an internet connection, just scroll into random airports in Mexico on Google Maps. But this airport that it's just northeast of Mexico City Airport. It's an airport. Like if you look at it on the map, there are the runways. I see where the terminal was going. And there's nothing around. I mean, I think those are like kind
are you talking
flooded.
about the new airport or the
no, the one
airport?
that wasn't finished. Not AIFA.
Right.
Which is
it was turned into an eco park, supposedly.
What's that mean?
The whole site. I don't know.
Left it there.
They flooded it, so it becomes a lake.
Oh wow!
And that will attract ducks, I guess, or I don't know.
It's kind of an airport.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
it's sort of an airport. You're right.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Technically, it is.
It is. Yeah, you do have things that fly that land there. Right. So therefore, it's an airport. It's a that's right. Environmental airport.
You're right. Yeah. Right. Where they dug out the foundation for the terminal, which you can see is actually water. Wow.
Yes. There are some people talking here about eventually, if the government, I mean, politics allow it, eventually reviving that project. But I don't know if it's already destroyed beyond salvation.
Yeah, water will do some pretty good damage. Yeah. Wow.
A lot of money underwater there.
Literally,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, because besides the construction techniques for that airport were very sophisticated because the land there, it's not very stable. But I mean, some airports have been built on water, so it's totally doable.
Yeah,
yeah. And then if you look just east off the east end of the runways for Mexico City Airport today, you will see a lot of basically Carlos's resume parked in tails.
Yeah, some of those are there. Some of those are there.
Wow.
Some of the Aero California.
Aero California, those DC-9s, they're...
But those are not really the ones I like to look at. I like to look at the ones that left.
The ones that left.
That were taken away. Yeah. Actually, those are probably the ones we didn't have a chance to work on.
Yeah,
probably. Yeah. Wow. Well, look, Carlos, it's been fantastic talking to you. I'm so glad that Mr. Reinot introduced you to you because it's been fascinating. You know, you've got a great career, and we appreciate you sharing that with us today. So thank you for making the time to speak with us.
Thank you for having me. As I said at the beginning, it's an honor to have chatted with you guys and to portray how it is down here. That I think a lot of my colleagues around the world need to take a look and see how things happen when they get real.
That's right. Well, you always hear versions of the stories, right? So it's nice to be able to hear it from somebody that's lived through it and is trying to, get his customers to go through the process and successfully. So it's definitely very nice to hear.
That's our job. So thank you so much for the conversation. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I've decided I just need to pull the microphone closer to my face.
Very nice. It does hide some of your face, which is fantastic.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavan of Collateral.
Collateral? Yeah, Collateral. That's a good one.
Yeah, Catastrophal.
Catastrophe.